Welcome to Sleep Fast. On this channel, we share slow, calm stories designed to help you fall asleep faster. Each story focuses on simple, repetitive processes with no tension, because the goal is to let your mind relax and gently unwind. Tonight, you'll listen to a complete, unhurried story about how ordinary clay in the year 1840 was processed and turned into bricks. Every step, every rhythm, every slow detail of this old trade. Nothing exciting, nothing surprising. Just a quiet, repetitive routine meant to help your eyes close and your thoughts drift away. Put on your headphones, relax, and let's begin. The Brickmaker's Long Winter. Chapter 1. The Selection and Weathering of the Clay. In the late autumn of 1839, as the golden light began to fade across the low-lying wetlands of the valley, the process of creating a single brick began not with fire, but with a profound, heavy stillness. The brickmakers of this era understood a truth that modern industry has long forgotten. The time is the most important ingredient in the earth. They would walk across the fallow fields, their heavy leather boots sinking slightly into the sodden turf, searching for a very specific type of subsoil. This was the strong clay, a dense, prehistoric sediment that had settled at the bottom of ancient glacial lakes thousands of years prior. To find it, they had to remove the overburden, the top layer of organic soil, grass, and decaying leaves. Imagine the rhythmic sound of a spade slicing through the damp earth. Shh, clink. The metal edge hitting a small, smooth river stone. Shh, clink. Once the topsoil was cleared, the clay was revealed. It was a deep, muted gray, sometimes veering into a dull ochre. But this clay, in its raw state, was stubborn. It was clumpy and held within it pockets of unwanted gases and uneven moisture. It could not be worked yet. It needed to be weathered. The workers began the arduous and repetitive task of casting the clay. They would dig deep into the earth, lifting heavy, wet spadefuls of the dense material and tossing them into long, low mounds called heaps. Each heap was approximately 4 feet high and 6 feet wide, stretching out across the field like the silent barrows of a forgotten civilization. As the weeks turned into November and then December, the atmosphere changed. The damp, heavy air of the valley turned brittle and cold. This is where the true work of the 1840 brickmaker began, the work of waiting. The clay heaps were left entirely exposed to the elements. This was a deliberate choice. Imagine the first frost of 1839. It would arrive in the early hours of the morning, a thin, crystalline blanket settling over the mounds of gray clay. As the temperature dropped below the freezing point, the water molecules trapped deep within the dense clay began to change. They expanded. In the microscopic world between the plates of silicate that make up the clay, tiny shards of ice began to grow. This expansion was slow, glacially slow. Each night, the ice would push the clay particles a fraction of a millimeter apart. Each day, as the pale winter sun struggled to rise above the horizon, the ice would melt and the clay would settle back down. But it would never be the same. The internal structure was being broken down. This process, known as mellowing, was essential. If you were to stand in that field in January 1840, you would hear nothing but the whistle of the wind through the bare branches of the nearby willow trees. The clay heaps sat in total silence. Occasionally, a heavy rain would fall, a cold, rhythmic drumming on the mounds, washing away the surface salts and impurities. The rain would soak deep into the center of the heap, ensuring that the moisture was distributed with perfect boring uniformity. By February, the heaps were subjected to the great thaw. The cycle of freezing at 2 a.m. and thawing at 11 a.m. repeated itself dozens, perhaps hundreds of times. A worker might walk by and poke the clay with a finger. In November, it would have been hard and resistant. Now, it was becoming short, a term used to describe clay that crumbles easily between the thumb and forefinger. The patience required was immense. There was no way to hurry the winter. There was no way to speed up the molecular expansion of the freezing water. The brickmaker simply watched the sky. He watched the way the frost patterns formed on the surface of the mounds. He waited for the gray of the winter sky to turn into the soft, pale blue of early March. By the time the first snowdrops appeared at the edge of the woods, the clay had undergone a total transformation. It was no longer a stubborn part of the earth. It was a softened, purified material, ready for the next slow stage of its journey. The air remained cool, the ground remained damp, and the long, slow transition into the year 1840 continued, one frozen night at a time. As the transition from late winter to early spring progressed, the scrutiny of the clay became even more meticulous. The master brickmaker would return to the mounds day after day, not to move them, but simply to observe the slaking of the heaps. To the untrained eye, the mounds looked like stagnant piles of dirt, but to the brickmaker, they were a living, breathing laboratory of mineralogy. He would kneel on the cold, damp ground, reaching out with calloused hands to pull a single clump of clay from the center of the heap. He would break it apart slowly, his eyes searching for the veins of the earth, unwanted inclusions that could ruin 1,000 bricks if not identified now. He looked for small nodules of lime, no larger than a grain of mustard seed. If these tiny limestone pebbles remained, they would later expand in the heat of the kiln, causing the finished brick to blow or shatter. This was a process that could not be automated. It required the slow, drifting attention of a man who had nowhere else to be. The air in March of 1840 carried a specific scent, a mixture of thawing mud, decaying reeds from the riverbank, and the faint, metallic tang of the wet iron spades leaning against the wooden shed. The workers began the turning of the heaps. This was a task designed to test the limits of human endurance through sheer repetition. Each man would take his position at the edge of a mound. Using a heavy, flat-bladed spade, he would shave off a thin layer of clay from the outer surface, perhaps only 2 inches thick, and toss it toward a new pile. This ensured that the clay which had been on the inside of the heap, protected from the frost, was now exposed to the final, lingering bites of the winter wind. Shh, clack, shh, clack. The rhythm was steady, like a slow beating heart. The workers did not speak. In the silence of the 1840 countryside, the only sound was the friction of the spade against the silt. Every few shovelfuls, a worker would pause to pick out a stray root or a piece of flint. The movement was fluid. Bend, lift, toss, pause. Bend, lift, toss, pause. This manual purification was a form of meditation. The clay was being refined by the touch of human hands. They were feeling for the plasticity, the ability of the material to be molded without cracking. They would take a small piece, roll it into a thin worm between their palms, and loop it into a circle. If the circle stayed smooth, the clay was becoming ready. If it cracked, it needed more time. more wind, more rain, more waiting. The chemistry of the 1840 brick was also dependent on the alkalis within the soil. Throughout the month of April, the spring rains would wash through the turned heaps. This was a natural leaching process. It slowly carried away the excess salts that might cause efflorescence, that white powdery film sometimes seen on old buildings. The brickmakers watched the runoff water in the shallow trenches around the heaps. They watched the clarity of the water, waiting for the moment it ran clear, signaling that the clay was chemically balanced. There was no clock in the field, only the movement of the sun across the horizon and the changing length of the shadows cast by the clay mounds. The shadows would start long and thin in the morning, stretching across the damp grass, then shrink to nothing at noon before lengthening again toward the east. This cycle of light and shadow was the only measurement of progress. By the end of the second month of turning, the clay had reached a state of homogeneity. It was no longer a collection of different strata from the earth. It had become a single, unified mass of potential. It was dense, cool to the touch, and held a weight that felt ancient. It was the weight of compressed centuries, now prepared by a season of frost and a season of rain, to be shaped by the hands of men. The heaps now stood taller and more refined, waiting for the first truly warm day of May, when the moisture content would be just right for the tempering pits. But until that day arrived, the clay sat in the silence of the meadow, a monument to the slow, boring, and beautiful passage of time in the year 1840. Chapter 2. The Infinite Circle of the Tempering Pit. As the calendar of 1840 turned toward the warmer, humid days of May, the weathered clay, having been broken by frost and washed by spring rains, was finally ready to leave its silent mounds. But it was not yet a material that could be shaped. It was still too raw, too uneven. It needed to be tempered. This was a process of homogenization that would take place in the tempering pit, a stage of production so repetitive and slow that it seemed to suspend time itself. Imagine a large, circular pit dug into the heavy earth, lined with thick planks of weathered oak to prevent the soil from contaminating the purified clay. In the center of this circle stood a vertical wooden post, a pivot that had been smoothed by years of friction. Attached to this post was a long horizontal beam of heavy timber, extending outward like the hand of a massive, slow-moving clock. At the end of this beam was the pug mill, or in simpler operations, a series of heavy iron blades. And to pull this beam, there was the horse, the rhythm of the hoof. The horse used for the tempering pit was typically a draft horse, a beast of immense patience and steady gait. Day after day, from the first light of dawn until the purple hues of twilight settled over the fields, the horse would walk. It did not walk in a line. It walked in a circle, a perfect, never-ending circle, approximately 20 feet in diameter. Step, 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 step. The sound of the horse's hooves on the packed earth around the pit was a constant rhythmic thud. Thump, shush, thump, shush. The shush was the sound of the horse's heavy breath, a rhythmic exhalation that misted in the cool morning air. The horse was blinkered, its world reduced to the 2 feet of path directly in front of its nose. It didn't need to see the horizon. It only needed to feel the steady resistance of the beam, the mashing of the mineral. Inside the pit, the clay was shoveled in by hand, one heavy spadeful at a time. a worker known as the temperer stood by with a long wooden pole and a bucket of water drawn from a nearby well. As the horse pulled the blades through the clay, the temperer would add water. Not a flood of water, but a rhythmic sprinkling, a gentle, steady rain that fell in arc-like patterns over the turning mud. The blades would slice through the clay, folding it over itself. Squish, suck, slap. The sound of the clay being worked was thick and wet. It was the sound of air bubbles being forced out of the mineral mass. Every rotation of the horse compressed the clay further, breaking down the last remaining clumps until the texture began to change from earth to dough. The temperer watched the surface of the pit with a gaze that was almost hypnotic. He was looking for the sheen. When the clay reached the perfect state of temper, it would take on a dull, waxy glow. It would become so dense that the blades would groan against the timber beam, a low structural creak that vibrated through the ground. The weight of repetition hours would pass. The sun would climb to its zenith, baking the tops of the nearby willow trees, but the horse continued its circle. 10 rotations, 50 rotations, 200 rotations. The path under the horse's hooves became a deep groove, a physical record of the day's labor. The air around the pit was heavy with the scent of wet minerals and horse sweat, a pungent, earthy aroma that signaled the birth of something solid. There was no conversation. The horse knew its job, the temperer knew his rhythm. The world outside the brickyard, the politics of 1840, the distant steamships, the growing cities, did not exist here. There was only the circle, the center, the blades, and the slow, inevitable transformation of the mud. If you were to watch this process, your eyes would eventually lose focus. The repetitive movement of the beam, the rhythmic thud of the hoofs, and the glistening, swirling patterns of the clay in the pit created a visual lullaby. Every shove of the spade was identical to the one before it. Every drop of water hit the clay with the same weight. By the time the horse was unhooked for the evening, the clay in the pit had become a singular, unified substance. It was no longer a collection of particles. It was a body, a thick plastic mass ready to be carried to the molding table. But for now, as the sun dipped below the trees, the pit sat in silence, the clay settling into a deep, heavy rest, waiting for the hands of the molder in the morning. As the horse continued its 17th or perhaps its 18th circuit of the hour, the focus shifted to the quality of the water being introduced into the tempering pit. In 1840, water was not merely a liquid. It was a tool. The brickmakers preferred soft water, often collected in large wooden cisterns from the previous month's rainfall, or drawn from the slow-moving eddies of a nearby stream. Hard water, rich in calcium, would react poorly with the silicate plates of the clay, making it short or brittle. So, the temperer would test the water by letting a few drops fall onto his palm, feeling for a certain slipperiness. This water was then added to the pit with the shaking motion of a wide-mouthed wooden scoop. The water didn't just sit on top. It had to be seduced into the clay, the anatomy of the mix. Inside the pit, the clay was undergoing a physical change that was invisible to the naked eye, but felt by the very bones of the horse. This was the process of homogenization. Imagine the clay as millions of tiny, flat, microscopic plates. In their raw state, these plates were stacked haphazardly like a deck of cards thrown onto a table. The job of the horse, the beam, and the iron blades was to align these plates. With every slow, grinding pass of the mill, the blades forced the plates to slide over one another, lubricated by the thin film of soft water. The resistance felt by the horse was the viscosity of the earth. In the early morning, the resistance was high and jerky. The beam would shudder as it hit a pocket of drier material. But by mid-afternoon, the resistance became smooth, heavy, and constant. The beam no longer shuddered. It hummed with a low-frequency vibration that could be felt in the soles of the workman's feet. The horse's trance. The horse itself had entered a state of work trance. Its ears, once twitching at the sound of a distant bird or the shout of a passerby, now hung at a relaxed, neutral angle. The blinkers on its eyes limited its universe to a small patch of trodden dust and the rhythmic tail of the beam in front of it. The animal's breathing had synchronized with its footsteps. Huff, step, huff, step. The smell of the horse's warm coat mixed with the damp, cool smell of the deep clay, creating an olfactory atmosphere that was heavy and sedating. Occasionally, the horse would let out a long, fluttering sigh, a nicker of pure repetition that echoed off the wooden walls of the drying sheds. It was the sound of a creature that had accepted the circularity of time. The texture of the pug. The pug, as the tempered clay was now called, was becoming a masterpiece of consistency. The temperer would periodically stop the horse. The silence that followed the stopping of the hooves was sudden and deafening. In that silence, the man would reach into the pit and pull out a handful of the mass. He would squeeze it. He was looking for tenacity. The clay should squeeze through his fingers like thick ribbons of silk, holding its shape without sagging, yet soft enough to take the impression of his fingerprint down to the smallest swirl of skin. He would smell the clay. It should smell of deep earth and ancient rain with no hint of sourness. If the mix was too dry, he would signal the horse to continue and add exactly 3 more scoops of water. If it was too wet, he would add a basket of grog, finely ground bits of previously burnt bricks, to soak up the excess moisture. This adjustment was done with the deliberation of a clockmaker, despite the fact that they were dealing with tons of mud. The creak of the wood, as the evening shadows began to stretch, those long 1840 shadows that seemed to turn the world into a sepia photograph. The wooden pug mill itself began to protest in the most rhythmic way. The friction of the wooden axle against the grease-soaked socket created a high-pitched, melodic creak, grind, creak, grind. This sound became the metronome of the brickyard. It told the workers, without them having to look at the sun, exactly how many rotations were left before the day was done. It was a tiring sound, but also a comforting one. It signaled that the earth had been tamed. The stubborn, frozen clay of January had finally been broken, moistened, turned, and smoothed into a material that was ready to take a human shape. The horse's pace would slow just a fraction more as the light turned amber. The pug in the pit was now a dark, glistening pool of perfect potential. It sat there, thick and silent, a heavy foundation for the houses that would one day be built from it. Houses that would stand for 200 years because of the patience of a horse and the slow turning of a beam in a dusty circle. Chapter 3. The Molder's Bench and the Architecture of the Hand. As the sun rose on a humid morning in June 1840, the pugged clay was finally ready to be transformed from a shapeless mass into a geometric reality. This stage took place at the Molder's Bench, a heavy, stationary altar of oak stained dark by decades of wet earth and constant use. The geometry of the bench. The bench was a masterpiece of ergonomic simplicity. To the left sat the clot moulder, usually a younger apprentice. In the center stood the master moulder, and to the right, the off-bearer. The bench was positioned near the tempering pit so that the transport of the clay was as short as possible. Yet every movement was calculated to minimize unnecessary effort. A wooden wheelbarrow, its single iron-rimmed wheel creaking with a slow, rhythmic scree-clack, would arrive from the pit. It carried the dense, wet clay. The sound of the clay being dumped onto the bench was a heavy, muffled thwack. The sound of weight and density, the sand and the slip. Before a single brick could be formed, the moulder had to prepare the stockboard and the mold. In 1840, they used two primary methods, slop molding or sand molding. For our story, we look at sand molding, a process of incredible tactile detail. The moulder kept a tub of very fine kiln-dried sand at his side. This sand was not coarse beach sand. It was soft, almost like flour, gathered from specific inland deposits. He would take the wooden mold, a rectangular frame made of beech wood, reinforced with strips of iron at the corners, and dip it into the sand. He would shake the mold with a practiced, vibrating motion of his wrists. Shaka, shaka, shaka. The sand would coat the wet wood of the mold perfectly. Any excess was tapped out with a gentle thud against the bench. This thin layer of sand acted as a parting agent, ensuring that when the clay was eventually released, it would slide out with sharp, clean edges, leaving behind a beautiful, slightly granular texture on the surface of the brick. The strike and the throw. Now came the throw. The apprentice would take a piece of clay, the clot, and roll it roughly into the shape of a large loaf. He would pass this to the master moulder. The moulder would lift the clay high above his head, his muscles tensing in a slow, controlled arc, and slam it down into the sand-dusted mold. Bam! The sound was solid. It was the sound of air being forcefully expelled from the corners of the frame. The clay had to fill every cubic millimeter of the mold. If there was a gap, the brick would be weak. If there was an air pocket, it would explode in the kiln. Once the clay was seated, the moulder took the strike, a flat, wet piece of wood, often soaked in a bucket of water, known as the strike tub. With a single, slow, horizontal motion, he drew the strike across the top of the mold. Lick. The excess clay, known as frog eye, was wiped away, leaving a perfectly flat, glistening surface. The moulder's hands moved with the precision of a machine, yet with the soul of a craftsman. He did this 20 times a minute, 1,200 times a day. The pulse of production. If you stood by the bench in 1840, you would be mesmerized by the repetition. Dip the mold in sand, tap out the excess, receive the clot, throw the clay, strike the surface, release the brick. Each brick weighed about 7 pounds in its wet state. By midday, the moulder would have moved tons of earth using nothing but the leverage of his shoulders and the rhythm of his breath. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood, drying sand, and the metallic tang of the clay. The bricks were then placed onto pallet boards, small, thin slips of wood to be carried away. Each pallet board had been sanded smooth so as not to mar the face of the new brick. The off-bearer would take 2 or 3 pallets at a time, walking with a stiff-legged, careful gait toward the drying hacks. He walked as if he were carrying glass, for a single stumble would turn the perfect rectangles back into shapeless mud. The silence of the formed earth. As the thousands of bricks began to fill the yard, they looked like a vast, silent army. Each one was identical in shape, yet each bore the microscopic mark of the molder's thumb or the grain of the beechwood mold. They sat there, vulnerable and soft, beginning the long process of losing their water to the summer air. The sun of 1840 would beat down on the yard, and the bricks would begin to change color, fading from a dark, wet gray to a pale, chalky tan. This was the stiffening, a quiet, motionless transformation that required no human intervention, only the passing of hours, the movement of the wind, and the heavy, sleepy heat of the afternoon. As the afternoon of this June day in 1840 stretched on, the heat became a heavy, palpable blanket over the brickyard. The rhythm at the bench did not break, but it evolved into a deeper, more mechanical state. Every element of the process had its own micro-history, its own slow-motion texture that contributed to the eventual sleepiness of the yard. The mold boy and the ritual of cleaning. Beneath the main activity of the master molder, there was the constant quiet work of the mold boy. His task was the definition of repetitive labor. Every time the molder released a brick, the wooden mold was handed back to the boy. The mold, now damp and clinging with remnants of clay, had to be perfectly cleaned before it could be sanded again. The boy used a leather clout, a scrap of stiff, water-soaked oxhide. He would wipe the interior walls of the beechwood frame. Swish, clack, swish, clack. He followed the grain of the wood, ensuring that no microscopic pebble or stray fiber remained. If he missed even a speck of clay, the next brick would have a scar, a tiny indentation that would weaken its structural integrity during the firing process. The boy's eyes were fixed on the four corners of the frame, moving back and forth, in a trance-like state of inspection. The physics of the throw. When the master molder received the clot of clay, he didn't just drop it. He performed what was known as the double-handed slam. This required a specific muscular coordination. He would grip the clay, feeling its cool, dense weight, roughly 8 to 9 pounds of wet material. As he slammed it into the mold, the air trapped at the bottom had to escape. The mold board had a small carved indentation in the center, known as the frog. As the clay was forced into this indentation, it made a soft, hollow, thump-gurgle sound. This frog served two purposes. It reduced the amount of clay needed, saving weight, and it created a key for the mortar to grip later. Watching the clay fill the frog was like watching a slow-motion liquid. It didn't splash. It flowed with the grace of heavy cream, settling into the corners and assuming the identity of a brick for the very first time. The strike wire alternative. On some days, when the clay was particularly fat or sticky, the molder would put down his wooden strike and pick up a strike wire. This was a thin piece of brass wire stretched between two wooden handles, much like a cheese cutter. He would draw the wire across the top of the mold. The wire would hum, a low, musical ping, as it cut through the silt and sand. This method left a different texture on the top of the brick, a series of microscopic ridges like the waves on a calm lake. If you were to watch the wire pass through the clay, you would see tiny particles of mica and quartz being pushed aside, glinting for a split second in the 1840 sunlight before being buried again in the mud. The careful migration, the off-bearer responsible for moving the fresh bricks, walked on a path of running planks. These were long, springy boards of spruce laid end to end across the muddy yard. His walk was a specialized shuffle. He could not lift his feet too high, or the vibration would cause the soft, green bricks to slump. Instead, he glided. Slide step, slide step. The planks would bend slightly under his weight, making a rhythmic creak thump sound against the soft earth below. Each time he reached the drying area, he would gently slide the brick off the pallet and onto the ground. The brick would make a faint hiss as it touched the dry sand of the floor. He would then stand up slowly, stretch his lower back, and begin the long, silent walk back to the bench. The air was so still that you could hear the distant tolling of a church bell from the village, miles away. The sound traveled over the flat fields, muffled by the humidity, marking an hour that no one in the brickyard felt the need to count. There was only the bench, the mold, the clay, and the sun. Chapter 4. The Drying Hacks and the Architecture of Air. As we move away from the rhythmic clatter of the molding bench, we enter the quietest, most expectant part of the brickyard, the drying hacks. In the year 1840, a brick could not simply be tossed into a fire. It contained nearly a pint of water, and if that water were to boil inside the clay, the brick would explode into 1,000 fragments. The bricks needed to bleed their moisture, and they had to do it with agonizing slowness. The geometry of the hacks. The hacks were long linear rows where the green bricks were stacked to dry. Imagine rows that stretched for hundreds of feet, perfectly parallel, like the foundation of a phantom city. Each row was exactly 2 bricks wide and about 10 bricks high. The off-bearer would place the bricks in a scintilled pattern, an old 19th century term for stacking them at an angle. Instead of being flush against one another, each brick was turned slightly, creating a series of small, diamond-shaped gaps. These gaps were the lungs of the brickyard. They allowed the gentle, humid summer breeze to pass through the stack rather than just around it. If you were to lie down on the grass and listen near a hack, you would hear the air whistling softly through thousands of tiny corridors. It was a low, hushing sound, like a long, drawn-out shh that never ended. The protection of the straw. Because the 1840 weather was unpredictable, the bricks had to be protected from the direct heat of the midday sun and the sudden violence of a summer rain. The tops of the hacks were covered with hack caps, long V-shaped wooden roofs, or more commonly, a thick insulating layer of clean rye straw. The straw was laid with a meticulous, boring precision. Each stalk was aligned to shed water. The smell of the drying straw, heating up under the July sun, mixed with the damp, earthy scent of the clay to create an aroma that was thick, sweet, and incredibly sedating. It was the smell of a barn in the middle of a hot afternoon, where time feels like it has turned into honey. The leather-hard transition. Over the course of 3 to 6 weeks, the bricks underwent a transformation known as stiffening. They moved from being green, soft and pliable, to being leather-hard. During this time, the brickyard was a place of watchful waiting. A worker, often an older man whose joints could no longer handle the throw of the molding bench, would walk the rows. This was the hack turner, His job was the definition of monotony. He would walk to the first row, reach out with a slow, steady hand, and flip each brick over. Flip, flip, flip. The sound was a dry, dusty tick as the clay touched the wood or the sand. By turning the bricks, he ensured that the moisture was drawn out evenly. If one side dried faster than the other, the brick would warp into a banana shape, making it useless for a straight wall. The micro movement of the clay. If you could zoom in and watch a brick during these 3 weeks, you would see a slow motion collapse. As the water evaporated, the clay particles drew closer together. The entire brick would shrink by nearly 10%. You could see the water smoke, though it was invisible to the eye, rising slowly into the air. The brick was becoming lighter, changing from a dark, heavy gray to a dusty pale rose or a dull buff color. It was losing its life as mud and gaining its soul as stone. The silence of the noon. At midday in the brickyard, when the sun was at its highest, the workers would often take a nooning under the shade of the willow trees. The horse in the tempering pit would stop. The molder's bench would go silent. In that silence, the only thing happening was the drying. Thousands upon thousands of bricks, sitting in the sun, breathing out their moisture. The stillness was absolute. The only movement was the shimmering of the heat waves above the straw-covered hacks. It was a world suspended in a state of preparation, where the only requirement was the passage of time. The bricks would sit there for 21 days, through the cool dews of the morning and the heavy heats of the afternoon, until they were bone dry, so dry that if you tapped 2 of them together, they would no longer make a thud, but a faint, metallic clink. The final breath of the green brick, the transition from leather hard to bone dry in the year 1840, was a period of extreme static patience. If you were to walk through the yard during the 4th week of drying, the atmosphere would feel heavy with the weight of millions of silent objects. The moisture had now retreated from the surface, hiding in the very center of each brick, and the process of drawing it out required a specialized, almost invisible labor. The ritual of the final turn. Before the bricks could be moved to the kiln, the hack turner performed his final, most delicate ritual. He would move down the rows with a rhythmic side-to-side sway. This time, he didn't just flip the bricks, he edged them. He would stand each brick up on its shortest, thinnest side. Clink, clink, clink. The sound was different now. It was no longer the wet thud of the previous weeks. It was a higher pitch, a dry, stony sound that echoed off the wooden hack caps. By standing them on their edges, the turner exposed the bed of the brick, the largest surface area, to the wandering currents of the summer air. This was the final insurance against shuffing, the internal cracking that occurs when a brick is fired while still holding a secret pocket of dampness. The microclimate of the row. Inside the stack, a strange microclimate had formed. Even on a hot July afternoon, if you were to place your hand into the diamond-shaped gaps of the scintilled stack, the air would feel significantly cooler. The bricks were still sweating at a microscopic level. This evaporation created a thin, cool boundary layer of air that hugged the clay. The wind had to work to peel this layer away. A brickmaker would watch the way the morning dew vanished. If the dew lingered on the northern end of a hack, he knew the wind had been stagnant, and the bricks there needed another 2 days of stillness. Every observation was slow. Every decision was measured in sunrises, the dusting of the surface. As the bricks reached their ultimate dryness, the fine molding sand began to lose its grip. A very fine, pale dust would begin to settle at the base of the hacks. This was the shedding of the coat. The bricks were now so dry that they felt almost velvety to the touch. When a worker picked one up, he would blow a soft breath across the surface to check the color. Whish! A small cloud of pale dust would rise and drift away in the sunlight, revealing the true naked color of the 1840 clay, a soft, muted ochre or a dusty gray. The silence of the field. By late August, the drying field was a sea of stillness. The grass between the hacks had grown long and golden, its seeds occasionally blowing into the stacks. The frantic pace of the spring digging and the rhythmic thumping of the tempering pit felt like a distant memory. The yard was now in a state of limbo. The bricks were no longer earth, but they were not yet stone. They were fragile, like unbaked biscuits. If a heavy wagon passed too closely, the vibrations of the iron-rimmed wheels through the soil could cause a stack to shudder. The workers moved with a quiet respect, their boots making a soft crunch-crunch on the sandy paths. The entire landscape was waiting for the gathering, the moment when these millions of individual units would be hauled away to be built into the great, smoldering pyramid of the kiln. But for now, they simply sat under the rye straw, absorbing the last bit of summer heat, perfectly still, perfectly dry, and perfectly boring. Chapter 5. The Clamp Kiln, the Slow Fire. Now, the story shifts from the air to the fire. In 1840, many bricks were fired in a clamp, not a permanent building, but a massive temporary structure made of the bricks themselves. This was a process that lasted for weeks, involving a heat that moved through the stack with the speed of a crawling insect. Building the pyramid, the setters would begin by creating a foundation of already fired bricks. Upon this, they would build the green bricks into a mountain that could be 30 feet high and 50 feet wide. Inside the base of this mountain, they built live holes or flues, long tunnels filled with faggots of wood and layers of breeze, finely crushed coke or coal. The stacking was an architectural marvel of boredom. Every brick had to be placed exactly half an inch from its neighbor to allow the fire to creep through the gaps. Thud, slide, position, thud, slide, position. Imagine the setters working in the early morning mist. They would pass bricks from hand to hand in a human chain. Catch, swing, release. Catch, swing, release. The movement was so fluid, it looked like the men were part of a slow-moving machine. By the end of the week, a massive, windowless cube of clay stood in the center of the yard, waiting for the first spark. The lighting of the flues. When the master burner finally approached with a torch, he didn't set a great blaze. He lit the lee side of the kiln first, letting the wind help the embers catch. The fire did not roar, it whispered. For the first 3 days, the temperature was kept intentionally low. This was the water smoking period. If you looked at the top of the kiln, you wouldn't see smoke. You would see a thick white steam. This was the combined water being driven out of the clay. It smelled like wet wool and old stone. The burner would sit on a wooden stool near the base, his eyes fixed on the color of the steam. He would sit there for 12 hours at a time, watching the white vapor slowly turn into a thin blue haze. This transition meant the moisture was gone, and the real firing, the vitrification, could begin. The incandescent heart of the 1840 clamp. Once the water-smoking phase was complete and the thick white steam had dissipated into the cool night air of the valley, the master burner initiated the full fire. This was not a sudden explosion of heat, but a slow, relentless rise in temperature that would take several days to reach its peak. In the year 1840, there were no thermometers to measure the thousands of degrees inside the clamp. The burner relied entirely on the color of the light and the smell of the air. The night vigil. The brickyard at night was a place of haunting, quiet beauty. The massive cube of bricks, which during the day looked like a dull mountain of clay, began to pulse with a hidden life. As the heat intensified, the cracks between the bricks started to glow. At first, it was a faint cherry red, so dim that you could only see it by cupping your hands around your eyes. But as the hours stretched into the early morning of the fourth day, the red deepened into a vibrant orange, and finally into a shimmering, ghostly white. The burner would sit on his low stool, wrapped in a heavy wool coat to ward off the midnight chill, while his face was bathed in the steady, unblinking radiance of the kiln. He watched for the settle. As the bricks reached the point of vitrification, where the clay particles actually begin to melt and fuse, the entire mountain of bricks would shrink and settle downward by several inches. This movement was so slow, it was invisible to the naked eye, but the burner tracked it by marking a wooden pole against the top edge of the stack. The breathing of the earth. The sound of a kiln at full fire is one of the most sleep-inducing sounds in the industrial world. It is not a roar, it is a respiration. Because the kiln was built with internal flues, the heat created its own draft. You could hear a low-frequency hum, a whoosh, as the oxygen was sucked into the base and the superheated air rose through the microscopic gaps between the bricks. Occasionally, a piece of coal in the breeze would pop with a muffled ptit, or a wooden faggot would settle with a soft crackle. But mostly, there was just the hum. It was the sound of the earth being forged, a vibration that seemed to come from the ground itself. It was a sound that made the eyelids heavy and the mind drift toward the ancient history of the soil. The smell of vitrification. The air around the clamp changed as the temperature reached its zenith, roughly 1,800 to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The smell of wet earth was gone, replaced by something metallic and sharp. The scent of silica melting and iron oxides reacting to the heat. It was a clean, dry smell, like the air after a lightning strike. The burner would occasionally take a long iron rod, known as a slice, and gently probe the fire holes. He did this with a slow, rhythmic motion, slide in, feel the resistance, slide out. He was feeling for the softness of the heat. If the rod slid too easily, the fire was too hot, and the bricks might melt into a single, useless glass-like mass called a clinker. If the resistance was too firm, he would add a single shovel of coal, scrape, scoop, toss. The coal would hit the embers with a sound like falling hail. Then, silence again. The uniformity of heat. The challenge of the 1840 clamp was ensuring the heat reached the very center. The burner would walk around the perimeter, his shadow stretching long and thin across the dusty yard, cast by the orange light of the kiln. He looked for cold spots, areas where the glow was a duller red. To fix this, he would adjust the wickets, temporary openings, to steer the wind. Everything was done with the deliberation that bordered on the holy. There was no room for haste. If the heat rose too quickly, the bricks would bloat with trapped gases. If it cooled too fast, they would shiver and crack. The fire had to be steered like a large, slow ship on a calm sea. By the 7th day, the soak was complete. The heat had saturated every single one of the 30,000 bricks. The master burner would take one last look at the white-hot light vibrating in the flues, nod to his assistant, and begin the process of daubing, sealing the openings with wet clay to snuff out the oxygen, and begin the long, slow descent back to the temperature of the living. Chapter 6. The Long Cooling and the Song of the Bricks, as the master burner sealed the final wicket with a thick wet paste of clay and sand. The active life of the kiln came to an end. But the bricks were not yet finished. They were currently at a temperature that would melt lead, glowing with a fierce internal light. Now began the most dangerous and most silent phase of all, the long cooling. In 1840, the cooling process was treated with as much reverence as the firing. If the cold air of the night were allowed to rush into the kiln too quickly, the bricks would suffer from thermal shock. They would shiver, a process where thousands of microscopic fractures would spiderweb through the clay, turning a structural masterpiece into a pile of red dust. The descent of light. For the first 48 hours after the fires were extinguished, the kiln remained a solid, radiating block of heat. If you stood 20 feet away, you could feel the warmth on your face like a phantom sun. Inside the sealed stack, the light began its slow retreat. The brilliant, vibrating white faded into a shimmering gold. The gold deepened into a rich, sunset orange. By the 3rd night, the orange had cooled to a somber, bruised purple. This was the blood heat of the brick. The master burner would return to the kiln, not to work, but to listen. He would press his ear carefully against the outer wall of the casing bricks. He was listening for the song of the bricks, the cooling song. As the silica and alumina in the clay contracted, the bricks began to sing. It was a sound composed of thousands of tiny metallic clinks and pings. Ting, click, click-it. It sounded like a field of glass crickets or the delicate ticking of 10,000 watches. This was the sound of the molecules settling into their final permanent positions. Each click was a tiny adjustment in the architecture of the stone. If the singing was too loud or too fast, the burner knew the kiln was cooling too quickly, and he would heap more dirt over the cracks to slow the escape of heat. The sound was rhythmic, irregular, and deeply hypnotic. In the silence of the 1840 night, with the moon hanging low over the sleeping fields, the kiln sang its metallic lullaby to the empty brickyard. The opening of the case. After a full week, sometimes two, depending on the size of the clamp, the kiln had reached a temperature where a man could touch the outer bricks without drawing back. The unfrocking began. The workers would arrive in the grey light of dawn, their movements slow and heavy. They began to peel away the outer layer of scoving, the protective coating of wet clay. The air that escaped from the center of the kiln was still warm and smelled of parched earth and ancient minerals. It was a dry, toasted scent that felt heavy in the lungs. As they reached the heart of the kiln, the true results of the 1840 season were revealed. The bricks were no longer the pale, dusty grey of the drying hacks. They had been transformed into a spectrum of permanence. The bricks from the center, where the heat was most intense, were blue clinkers, dark, heavy, and almost vitrified into glass. The bricks from the middle were the best reds, the perfect ringing architectural gems. The bricks from the outer edges, known as pales or place bricks, were a soft orange, underfired and destined for interior walls where they would never see the rain. The final rest. The bricks were moved from the kiln to the sorting ground with the same deliberate, repetitive motion that had defined their entire existence. Pick, clink, stack, pick, clink, stack. Each brick was now a solid, singular object. It had traveled from the frozen mud of January through the circular path of the horse, the slam of the moulder's bench, the long breath of the drying hacks, and the trial of the fire. By the end of the day, the kiln was an empty shell, and the yard was filled with neat, silent stacks of finished stone. The sun of 1840 set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the sorted rows. The work was done. The heat was gone. The earth had been turned into a city. And as the last worker shouldered his spade and walked toward his cottage, the only sound left was the wind moving through the long grass, whispering over the faces of 30,000 bricks that would outlive everyone who had touched them. The yard was still. The world was quiet. The bricks were at rest.